of things at CTRL, but I'm basically a qualitative and mixed methods methodologist that works. I'm the R in CTRL right now. I'm lucky enough today to have Duval from psychology and Jolynn Gardner from health studies with me, as we're going to go through and look at a couple different approaches in classes with, that focus on teaching with data of different types and integrate that into their classes in different ways. We'll just turn that off for a second so we don't have to stare at the light throughout the entirety of this. Before I turn it over to the two of them, let me set the stage a little bit and talk about how I approach integrating data into my classes and why I think that this is sort of not only a useful tool content-wise, but also a useful tool pedagogically when we think about achieving sort of the learning objectives of our students. So really the core of this sort of session, the way I approach it and think about it, is this is really about experiential learning, right? It's about ways in which we get our students' hands dirty, we get them to actually interact with sort of real-world data, real-world scenarios throughout this. And so what we're going to do today is spend a lot of time thinking about how you can integrate these things into your course. And that's not to say to build an entire course around sort of real-world data interaction. This could be a single assignment or assessment or exercise that you're building, or it could be a larger semester-long project. And before I go too much further, I just want to be clear on sort of what I mean when I say data in terms of this, because it's really easy to have this preconceived notion that when we're talking about these kind of things, we're talking about sort of traditional methods classes, we're talking about spreadsheets full of data, Stata, SPSS, SAS, applications like that. But really, I think it's more useful to have a discussion today with a very sort of wide-ranging definition of data. Certainly all of those things I just mentioned, but also integrating sort of qualitative data sources, whether we're talking about sort of working with surveys in your classes, whether we're talking about conducting interviews or focus groups, sort of archival research, any of these formats, that's really what I mean when I say data. So there's this much more broader, not just quantitative data, but also textual data, also qualitative data of other forms. Let me give you two examples from my own classes. That I teach in SPA, but I also teach in SIS. I just wrapped up a skills institute on sort of social media network analysis in SIS, right? It's a real traditional sort of methods course. The students in that course learn to work with software. They learn in vivo and R. In that course, we look at explicitly how to work with data in that. My students are getting, rather than working with sort of canned data sets, because it's social media data, we're looking at recent data. I taught it over the summer here, and so we're looking at the Twitter discourse around sort of the Helsinki summits and the Janus decision. So that's just topically where we have been teaching. But in addition to that, and sort of working with these larger data forms, I also have assignments in my class that work with a really personal form of data. So the first class that they do it, they fill out a survey form. And on that survey, it has all of the classes that they've taken within their major in the past year. So SIS classes they took within the last year. It also has a roster of the students, and the students are asked to check off any of the names that of a student they've had a class with before, right? So this generates some data for me, right? They take this survey. It's no more than a 5-minute survey, but it's sort of one of those traditional first day of class surveys where they tell me other information, what areas of the class they're most interested in, all that sort of demographic information that we might collect. So they do this for me, and by the next class, because of those 2 additional questions, I actually have really useful network data for myself, because I have who they've admitted to me they know. I also have a directed network, so I have the people that says, well, I admit to knowing Laura, but Laura does not admit to knowing me, right? So that can have some other implications to it. But we have network data from that, but we also have network data from knowing who has taken class A together in prior times, who has taken class B together in prior times. But basically all this does is it lets me build out that social network of the class, right? That sort of spiderweb diagram, which is really central to what we're talking about in this class. Looking at the who retweets who in social media, who mentions who. I can do that by personalizing this data by saying, listen, I asked you these two questions, and now when we start to look at the data, we actually can look at this in terms of a network of the class. So they can see both how the data was produced, and then they can see how the network was produced when we actually visualize it, right? We can ask questions about what are these actual statistics that we'll talk about. Well, what do they mean in the abstract, but what do they also mean when we think about sort of Laura and I's relationship to each other in the network and things like that. So that's sort of a traditional, real methods course approach to data. I also teach a public policy course, which is in no way a methods course. They don't use any of the software. But I design, one of the assignments they do is called an analysis of an analysis. And what it is it's a very close reading of a piece of policy analysis. And the idea there is that that's also getting them to work with and interact with real-world data, because they're going out to a think tank, they're going to the Congressional Budget Office, they're going to some place that produces policy analysis, and they're finding something that someone produced for an actual person that's relying on the interpretation of data. And so in doing this close reading and this deconstruction of it and thinking about the assumptions that went into writing this, I also consider that as having my students work with data. Because they're actually looking at, although they're not there with the spreadsheet, they're not there with the tool, they're actually looking at how this data was used and interpreted before. And so both of those things, and sort of two very different types of assignments, for me, get my students actually interacting with and working with sort of real-world data. And so pedagogically, I think that has some really useful things. One is it shows students the sort of messiness of data, because we're actually looking at things that, particularly with the class network example, they're producing. And we have a lot of really good examples within the students that forget that they were in classes with each other, but then all of a sudden they see each other, and they're, oh yeah, I guess I did have a class. I didn't recognize the name, so we can talk about missing data. We can talk about missing data not at random, right? If somebody just completely blocks a class out of their head. It also shows us the network that is likely going to be very deconstructed and decentralized, which is very different than a lot of the canned data sets show us. I think we do our students often a disservice by giving them sort of the canned data sets that come with the Stata instruction book or come preloaded in one of these software, because that's not data that they're going to see when they go downtown and work somewhere. They're not going to see these beautiful spreadsheets with no missing values, with all the labels on correctly. I think there's a very real pedagogical value in showing students how messy real-world data is, because it forces them to ask themselves questions about, well, what do we do in this scenario? How do we actually think this is biased? So the messiness is not a drawback. I think it's a teachable, valuable moment. The other part of this, I want to think for a moment about this sort of experiential learning of this. There's a lot of pedagogical writing on the value of experiential assignments and experiential learning within classrooms. And it goes back to sort of a model that was developed by Kolb in the 80s, and it basically comes through this sort of four cycle model of student learning. When we think about this in terms of having an experience and then processing that experience. And it's really built on the self-reflection throughout the experience of the student. And for me, that's what separates when we think about assignment design and actual achieving of our learning objectives. That's what separates these type of assignments from sort of a one-off, speaker or one-off sort of problem set I do one day, and something that actually speaks to the larger learning objectives of this course. So just to run through Kolb's model, when we think about students' learning experiences, right? In step one, the student has an experience, right? So maybe that's interacting with this data, and this can be larger things. Maybe it's hearing a guest speaker in class, it's going downtown and having a field trip for things, it's completing a problem set, it's the actual process of collecting the data. Whatever this experience is, they participate in the experience. In step two, the student reflects on that experience, right? So it's not enough to just have it, and if we have it and we never engage with it again outside of that one class period, then that's really this one-off thing. But to build into the assignment an actual reflection component, and where the student thinks about what was this experience, let's name the events that transpired, right? What stands out to me about this experience, about working with this data? What was unexpected? What role did I play in this process? What role did the other students play in the process? How do I understand these things? How do I make sense of them, right? So building this reflective component in, which is either sort of a process journal as students are going through this, in-class discussion. This can take a lot of different sort of reforms, a lot of different forms, requiring a reflective memo alongside. In the third step, after I've reflected, I start to make sense of my experience, right? I start to integrate this into a larger theoretical framework, right? This is where we move from the experience that I had in this one-off to the larger content of the course, right? So now I start thinking about how, well, what did we talk about 2 weeks ago that helps me make sense of the reflections I've had from this experience, right? And this is where this experiential learning component, the actual working, the getting your hands dirty component, starts to speak to the larger course. What's happening here is the student is taking the experience that they had, working with this data, collecting this data, and integrating this, making a personal model of sort of how this process works for themselves, right? And this could be sort of a specific sort of use of theories, right? Maybe in my public policy course, they thought about this and they witnessed how coalitions can build and how people can cooperate together. Or maybe this could be a very method-specific thing, right? They think about what data is missing in this, and they think about the realities of how bias can be introduced by who isn't surveyed or who doesn't get to participate in this project. So as we now start to construct sort of a larger theoretical model that's informed by their experiences here, then the next thing that they go in the fourth and sort of final step of this that internalizes the learning is to take this model and go and apply it to other experiences, other data, right? And it becomes this sort of cycle of we have an experience, we process it into our larger theoretical constructs, and then we take that revised personal model and we move it into the next step, right? So this, I think, if we approach the sort of experiential learning from a framework like that, that starts to build larger into the course rather than just having it as this individual standalone problem set that doesn't get returned to and isn't integrated into those really core learning objectives of the course. Okay. I just wanted to set the framework there by sort of thinking pedagogically about what I'll argue these type of assignments do, and then I wanted to turn it over to Laura first. But both Laura and Jolynn, I think, really have some interesting examples of exactly what I'm talking about here as they force their students or require their students to go out and work with, and to work with these actual sort of data of various forms and to make meaning of that for themselves. So with that,
I have to say that, Bill and I did not talk exactly about what we were going to be sharing as part of this, but I'm feeling very validated that I think I can take this assignment and walk through those 4 steps. So maybe I will, try and do that extemporaneously at the end. I teach an advanced methods course in the psych department every semester. And Bill is kind enough to come in and give a Qualtrics overview to my class every semester. And so being aware of what I do, he asked me to come share some of what I do in that class here today. So I am probably going to be the more kind of traditional approach to data in the classroom, of students collecting data and using it in a more, formulaic way, and Jolynn is going to kind of expand on that a little bit. So in addition to learning the core contents of a research methods class, my students are required to conduct an independent research project during the course of the semester. So each student has to come up with a topic, research the literature, come up with hypotheses, generate a research instrument, collect data, analyze data throughout the course of the semester. So it is a full semester long project. And I find that before we even get to the aspect of having data to use, to talk about, to have them analyze, that the individual student research projects are a great source of examples for the concepts that we're talking about in class. So if I'm talking about operationalizing variables, then I can say, let's talk about some of your projects. And at several points during the semester, I will have a quick roundtable, and the class is limited to 12 students, so it doesn't get too overwhelming, and have everybody introduce their project. And as they develop their project, we will do this a couple of times during the semester, so people are familiar with what other people are working on. It's really quite gratifying to walk into class and have someone say, hey Sam, I found a self-esteem inventory that you might be, I know you said you were looking for one or something. So maybe we're talking about operationalizing self-esteem, and I'll say, tell me what you guys have found. And maybe Sarah says, I found this one that, it's really got great reliability and validity, but it's 40 items long. I'm afraid it's going to be too long to put in. And someone else says, well, I found one that's only 10. And so there'll be this discussion of there's different ways to get at self-esteem. Or someone else might be trying to look at, maybe they're going to manipulate stress. And so they want to think about various ways that they can operationalize stress as an independent variable. And we'll talk about different ways that you can do this. And somebody, might come up with the idea of, well, I'm going to have people do math problems, and some of them get 2 minutes to do it, and others only get 30 seconds, and that's how I'm going to induce stress because they have a shorter period of time to do it. Which leads to a great discussion of mundane versus experimental realism, that sometimes it's not always about, whether the task is, realistic, but is it meaningful? Is it impactful, for the participants? So just them knowing that they're doing these projects and developing the projects, I find makes them so much more engaged in the material that I'm talking about content-wise in the class. I mentioned that Bill comes in and teaches them about Qualtrics. Normally that's how they collect their data. They do a Qualtrics survey. So he comes in and he leads them through a sample survey where they have to create different types of questions that use a lot of the key features of Qualtrics, and they dutifully follow along and do it, but I won't say they're mesmerized by the process. But then they have to start developing their own questionnaires. And as they develop their own questionnaires, they usually start with lots of open-ended questions. And then we talk about, well, let's talk about what this data is going to look like at the other end and how you're going to analyze this data. And they realize they're going to have to code all of this, and then they're going to have to enter it all in. Whereas if they can do a closed-ended question, that might, be a good approach for them to take. Well, then that leads to a whole nother set of questions, because they generally, because they've looked at surveys all their life, they'll say, how old are you? And they'll have 18 to 25, 26 to 34, and they'll have these categories. Most of them collect data by posting, and I'll get to that in a minute, but they post these links to their social media sites. Everybody's 18 to 26. There's not going to be any variability in their age, so we'll talk about there's lots of different ways to collect this. Do you want a categorical variable? Do you want a continuous variable? They're much more willing to engage in those conversations when it's about their project. I talk about things like double-barreled and loaded questions and things like that, but I find when we're talking about their actual survey, they're actually paying attention and engaged and care a little bit more about it. So the process of learning how to get data is useful, I find, in teaching the content of my course. But then, of course, there's actually the using and manipulating of the data. I should mention before I talk about that, about the ethics part of it, in case any of you think about trying to engage in this. They obviously don't go through the IRB. They don't have time to go through the entire AU IRB. What I have that I got before the IRB went completely online is a IRB PDF document of the IRB form, and that's what I have my students do. So they fill the actual AU IRB form out. It's just me and my TA that serve as the IRB. So that means that they can't, not that any of this data is publishable, they can't publish it, they can't present it, and I'm really very careful about the topics they use. I tell them no sex, no drugs, nothing illegal, nothing, so the topics that they think they want to do early on, I squash really, quickly. But stats is a prereq for this course, with all deference to anyone from the Math Stats department out there. They all come in and say, we don't remember anything though. You don't think we don't have to use this, do we? And there's kind of a look of panic that they're actually going to have to utilize this information. So I do walk through a review of statistics and stats with them, and I actually do a two-step process. I agree with Bill that data is messy, and they will realize that when they get to their own data. I do let them start with clean data. So I give them a fake data set. We go to the stat lab. I have a series of analyses that I have them go through with the fake data set. So everybody's doing the same thing in the same order. I have it, it's very, I have a nice little narrative, variables that make sense, analyses that all work out nicely for them. So it makes sense. They do a Pearson correlation coefficient, and lo and behold, there's a positive correlation between SAT scores and GPA. That they do a t-test, and psychology students spend more time in Asbury than chemistry students. So it's all nice and logical. One of the things I do is I build in some of the mistakes that I find students will do during the course of a semester. So I'll have them run a Cronbach's alpha on a 10-item scale that's part of the survey, and they run it and it comes out negative, and they get an error message that the model assumptions have been violated. And we kind of wait and let them talk through it, and they realize that they had to reverse score some of the items in that scale before they can actually run the analysis. And then they run it and it comes out right, and they're proud of themselves. So working through some kind of built-in mistakes and solving them, and then seeing the output when it's correct again, they become more confident working with a data set and using SPSS before they go into actually doing their own data. I do have them, before they work with their own data, meet with the TA and come up with a stat plan. So they have reviewed stats in class, they've done the fake data set, they are very invested in their own project at this point, and they're collecting their data. And I like them to kind of think through, before the data set is in front of them and they feel overwhelmed, based on what we talked about in class, what are you going to do? So they'll come in, and it's usually only a 15-minute meeting with the TA, so it's not too much time on his or her part in meeting with the students. And they'll say, all right, I know I have to reverse score these 3 items, then I have to aggregate these 8, and that's going to be a new variable, and that's going to be the dependent variable, and they kind of walk through it so that they know what they're going to be doing when they actually start analyzing their own data. And after that, at least half of them probably can jump in and start working on it on their own. And some of them need a little bit more help and assistance. There's always a huge amount of variability. Of course, they want their hypotheses to be supported, and honestly, that probably only happens maybe 25% of the time. But even hypotheses that are, not supported are a great way to talk about important aspects in a methods course. So we talk about the cyclical nature of research, that every research project, of course, ends up with new questions and new ideas for the next one. So maybe this one wasn't significant. What did you learn from it? What would you do next time? What would you change? They're actually, by this point, filled with ideas for things they would do different. Of course, the nature of this course is they're learning the content of research methods as